actually, I should give a little bit more background information. The CSX site is one of the largest undeveloped parcels in the city. Sits just a little bit outside of downtown Brockton and has been long vacant and, dare I say, derelict. And you know, it's become the site of Tent City and a lot of problems over the years. But now that CSX has no plans for using this as a rail site, it's incumbent upon the city to really explore how this area gets redeveloped. And what we want to do, working with you, is to create some concepts around which the site could see positive growth for the city, creating jobs, tax revenue, and housing opportunities. And so we're up and running now.
Good morning. Is it all set?
Yep.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thanks. Appreciate it.
So that brings us to where we are through the focus groups and through this initial open house. So, Emily, I'll take my drink too.
All right, so first of all, welcome. Delighted to see you all here. One of the things that we did was we had originally planned to do the presentation at 7 o'clock halfway through, but we got so many people early, we thought we'd just do the presentation twice so y'all don't have to hang around till 7, unless of course you want to, in which case you're more than welcome to. So we're going to kick this off. My name is Emily Innes. I am the Director of Planning at Harriman. Harriman is a design and engineering firm, and our urban design and planning studio is located in Boston. I'm here with my colleague Ryan from RKG Associates. They have RKG, Ryan and Eric have both been working on the economic portion. I will let him, and the market analysis, I'll let him talk a little bit more about that. And I'm here with my colleague Katie Moore, who is an urban planner with Harriman, and she has been working in great detail with me on this project. So. Today we're going to talk to you a little bit about the planning process and about the information that you see here in the back of the room on existing conditions, and then along the side are various scenarios that we've developed. We're going to tell you a little bit about those, both from the physical planning and design aspect and also from the market analysis and what that means. We urge you to go. These will be fine on screen, but you're not going to get the level of detail that you will when you go up and look at the boards. The purpose of this open house is really to give you all a chance to study the different scenarios and some of the implication of those scenarios, and then you should all have picked up a comment card in the back. We're looking for your opinions on the various options. So it is important to know that there is no planned project at the moment, that these are all concepts that show some possibilities for the site, and we're really looking for your input on those possibilities. So with that, the process kicked off in October. We did a bunch of initial analysis on the site, and then we've been working with a master plan committee. You'll see the yellow asterisks on there are the times that we've met with them. And we've been using their understanding and knowledge of the area to check some of the findings that we've discovered as we did the existing conditions analysis, and also to understand some of the scenario planning and make tweaks to that before we brought it to you tonight. We are there right where that blue line is. So after this, we will make tweaks to the scenarios based on what we hear from you tonight, and then we'll wrap that up into a final report that says, at this stage, these are the possibilities that we see for the site. So again, this isn't leading to a specific project, but it is leading to a report that captures all of this data for future use. So the boundary, the boards that I'm going to show you now are all in the back. So if you can't see them in great detail, you can, as I said, go up afterwards and have a look. The study area is this red boundary. One of the things that we're doing is we're looking not only at the CSX site itself, but some of the adjacent parcels. And the reason we do that is when we're doing a planning study, we try and make sure that we look at the entire context of an area, not just a parcel in isolation. And particularly because of Trout Brook and the impact of flood zones, once you start looking at flood zones or anything that crosses parcel boundaries, it's important to understand what that could mean in terms of future uses of a site. So The other thing that you have to think about with flood zones is if you are building on or near them, there are implications for how you structure the building. So the location of the flood zones and the regulatory zones around that is important. We also look at the current zoning. Again, this map is back up there. Just for general reference here, the big blob of purple is an industrial zone. Red is general commercial, and you'll see two slightly different variations on yellow that represents different residential densities. So when we look at the current zoning, what we're looking at is what has the city said can happen now on these sites. And that's important for us as we look at possible development scenarios, is what can happen now, and then whether or not, based on our existing conditions research, our market research, whether or not that zoning needs to change. And so as we get your input, that's something that we'll explore. And then finally, just to call it out so that all of you here know, the yellow is the area owned by CSX. And that is based, all of this information is based on GIS data and assessors data from the city. So I'm going to walk you through the illustrative plans, and Ryan and I are actually going to go back and forth as I talk to you about the development scenarios. He'll then talk to you about the market scenarios. So I want to kick you off for our base assumptions for the illustrative plans. These are things that you will see appearing in every single one of the scenarios. So the first is a pedestrian path along Trout Brook from Puffer Playground to Snow Park. And the idea is that this path would be tied into the neighborhoods at the east, but not into the commercial flex, rather, that you'll see popping up on the west. It was important as we talked to people, this idea that along Trout Brook, that get cleaned up, that be made accessible for people to walk along, and that it also connected the green areas and the park areas to the north and south. On the east side of Trout Brook, as we looked at the existing neighborhoods, we looked at how to connect some of the existing development patterns, some of the street patterns of the neighborhoods, and then looked at different types of housing that could fit in there. And you'll see the different types of housing as one of the things that changes from scenario to scenario. On the west side of Trout Brook, the side that's up against the rail line, we prioritize the idea of commercial flex development to support a mix of job and business types. This is because it's proximate to the downtown, it's also proximate to public transit, and it's away from the residential neighborhoods on the east side. We've also added some mixed use in there, and you'll see that's a difference in some of the scenarios. Part of the reason for knowing where the flood zones were and the regulatory floodway is so that we could think about expanded stormwater management, think about flood storage to maybe prevent some of the flooding that's happening and capture that near the brook rather than having it spill over into developed areas, especially the neighborhoods. And whether or not that meant that some parcels that suffer regular flood damage might need to be acquired. That is an open question, and just part of going back and forth on that. We understand that part of the area had been looked at in the past for the potential location of a public safety building. It's one of a couple of options out there, so we've left that into our thinking. And also the idea of adding market rate housing to the area, both in mixed use. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to tell you about himself a little bit and talk about his analysis.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay. Again, I'm Ryan Kirchhoff. I work for a firm called RKG Associates in Boston. And our job on this project is to look at these different ideas for development schemes on this site and try to determine what is feasible, financially feasible, what there's a market for, what's legal considering the zoning, use restrictions, things like that on the site. And then ultimately, if there are challenges to development, what it would take for the city or for a landowner to get it to a place where development is feasible. So the really cool creative side, I'd say, of this project, right? So. Thanks.
Yeah. Numbers.
That's right. So before we get into the scenarios, I just want to preface with a couple overarching challenges that exist on this site and really throughout a lot of Brockton that are important context to think about as you look at the boards and as you speak to us afterwards during the open house. So first, I'd say each of these scenarios that you'll see has multifamily housing components in it. And part of the reason for that is, yes, it is very close to the train station, which is this amazing asset that you have here in downtown Brockton, but also because we've seen that there's a market for it. We've seen development and redevelopment in downtown Brockton. So in terms of when you're evaluating what uses there could be a market for on the site, that's definitely one of them. But there definitely are challenges. We don't know quite how deep the market demand is for that type of development here. So we'll speak more about that as we go on. Industrial rents, the heritage of this site is industrial uses. You saw that the base existing zoning is industrial. It's challenging, though, to make new construction of industrial space work financially in almost any location, but especially one that's not near a highway. And we'll also talk a little bit about access to the site. There are some low bridges related to the commuter rail that would limit the trucks that are able to get into the site. So your rental estimates, your rent rate estimates for industrial make it really difficult for developers to come in there. This site, as Emily noted, is way bigger than just the one CSX owned parcel. I think it's 35 different parcels or something like that in the study area, owned by almost as many different owners. So in thinking about this as a very long range, very strategic process, the ability of the city over time to help assemble some of those parcels is going to be important to how closely these visions are achieved in the end. And then finally, I'd say, this is probably not news to anybody in this room, but there are difficulties with any type of new development in Brockton. It's difficult to do new development anywhere. Total construction costs are rising, and in Brockton we face the same construction costs that Boston does, with what really are a fraction of the rents typically. So for a developer to earn the return, or an investor to earn a return that would make them interested in doing ground up development is challenging. And we see that in every type of use. That doesn't mean that it can't happen or won't happen down the line, but that needs to be back of mind as we think about these different scenarios. Do you want to introduce?
Yeah.
Did you see something?
We'll go back.
So I think one of the things, everything that Brian said is important in understanding what we were going to show next, but I want to emphasize the fact that this is not something, none of these scenarios are something that would happen in a year's time or 2 years' time, or in many cases 5 years' time. The idea is to develop an overall vision for the area of what could happen, and this is critically important because it's easy to put a vision on paper, tie it to the numbers that say whether or not it is a realistic vision and what would be needed to accomplish that vision. And that's one of the reasons it's so important to have your input tonight, because we're looking to make sure this is sort of a check on what we're showing to see if the vision is appropriate. So we're going to look at three overall bubble scenarios and then 4 programmatic scenarios. The first one is looking at multifamily. So I remember I said that there'd be differences on the east side with the residential components and on the west side. In the first scenario, multifamily apartments are on the east side, with commercial flex on the west side of Trout Brook. In the second, we've looked at 2 different ways of adding mixed use onto the west side. So both sides in the residential area and the east side have townhouses, but on the west side, one of them has commercial flex and mixed use that doesn't include apartments. The second has mixed use apartments in there. And then finally, number 3 has single family on the east side and commercial flex and mixed use on the west side. So what we kicked off with, and I'll spend a little bit more on this one to sort of introduce the concept to you and where we're going, a little bit less on the others. We kicked off with what we call these bubble diagrams. The idea was to generally locate the different uses that we were looking at and testing without looking at actual development volumes. And once we located the uses, or in some cases before we located the uses, is to think about what those connections would be. So you can see on the east-hand side with the bright, yes, please. So please point to the future residential. So right in that area are,
Here's Elliott Street.
yes.
On the north, Court Street. This is the railroad tracks in Montello. Excuse me, that is Montello. This is the commuter rail line. And then this is Trout Brook that runs through the center of the site.
Great.
And those are proposed roads through it with the dots there?
Yes, so that's exactly it. And thinking about this side, one of the, on this east side with the future residential, what you're seeing is one method of connecting some of these streets to each other to kind of knit the residential area to the existing residential neighborhood. So that's one of the primary connections. The second primary connection, of course, we've already talked about, which is that pedestrian path from Puffer down to Snow Park along Trout Brook. And then what you see on the west-hand side, so rather than just say this whole area will be commercial flex, the idea was to show how roads might start to divide a very large site into smaller parcels that could be developed as either individual buildings or clusters of buildings. And one of the things you'll see as you look at each of the boards is that there's some photographic examples of some of the types of development that we were thinking about as we created these bubble diagrams. So the blue in there is a future municipal or flex use, a commercial flex site there. Anytime you see the bright yellow is a residential. Now, you called out Elliott and Court Street. These, of course, are the main streets that border this area. And one of the things that is interesting about them from the perspective of how we thought about development is that they have very low bridges over them, as Ryan had mentioned earlier. So in thinking about the types of uses that could access the commercial flex, it's not going to be something that requires a lot of that's tall, not a large truck that requires multiple deliveries a day, because they're going to find it difficult to access that. So, and then finally, and then there's the one that goes into the site itself. You'll see, sorry?
Porter Pass.
Porter Pass, thank you very much. So Porter Pass, you'll see with the other two, with Elliott and Court, the arrows go in both directions. With Porter Pass, it only goes in one direction. We are not envisioning that as a two-way access. It would be cars or pedestrians going out of the site, but certainly not cars going into the site, simply not wide enough for two-way access. And then you can see down at the bottom that we've identified the commuter rail platform and the transit center as well. So that allows us to know that all of these uses are proximate to public transit, both bus and commuter.
You know, the bridges were built by the railroad and are built to accommodate 2 wagons going in each direction. Unfortunately, we stopped traveling on wagons a while back. So now our vehicles and trucks, certainly trucks, are much bigger and make it more difficult to get under those bridges.
So the next slide, so you've seen the bubble diagram, and each one of the scenarios has a bubble diagram attached to it. This is where we start to pin down development volumes, and in all of these cases, we are testing what will fit on the site. So not necessarily what the market will absorb. And you'll see in a couple of the boards, there'll be a note that says something like, I think there's one that says 400 to 600 units, and in parentheses it says 5 to 10 years. That's because this market is not going to absorb 400 to 600 units in a year or 2 years or even 3 years. So while there may be a certain number of units that fit on the site, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's market demand for them. And that's why Ryan and his colleague Eric's work is so important to this process. So in this case, scenario 1, you start to see the multifamily apartments just gridded out. You'll note that the example that you'll see of multifamily apartments has them looking more like smaller buildings. Again, this is just a site to see how many or a test to see how many units could fit there. And then you start to see the way those blocks were created by introducing streets on the west-hand side. We start to develop buildings in the orange and parking behind them in the gray. And one of the things, of course, you have to figure out is whether or not the parking starts to meet that. And so now I am going to turn it over to you, Ryan, to talk about the volume and your sliders.
Sure. So, as Emily mentioned, the number of units in the space that we're talking about here, these are obviously kind of max build out in terms of what physically could fit on the space. Now, part of what we do then is forecast out lots of different assumptions related to cost and revenue to see, is this something that a developer or an investor would ever be interested in making happen? If not, what are the levers that the city could pull to try to make it happen if that's what the public decided that it wanted? So for flex commercial space, and Sorry if I missed out, I was talking to somebody. Did we define flex commercial
We
space?
did not define that.
Does anyone know what flex commercial space is? Rob?
So, flex commercial is a relatively wide term, and it can mean anything from very light industrial assembly to contractor bays, but it could also be higher scale commercial development, offices. There is a very large fiber optic bundle that runs through here from Boston to New York, and it kind of comes up above ground here, and there's an opportunity for us to take advantage of that. And so longer range, we might see some of this area get developed for more office space, maybe a data center, a couple of things in that category.
So the beauty of the commercial flex use, and this is something we heard a lot about in our working group meetings, but it is a way to be flexible, that's the word flex, flexible in a place where you don't know exactly what the market would be able to sustain, right? So we don't know exactly in this space, as I alluded to, how much industrial or light industrial use could be there. We don't really know what the office market could sustain. So this gives you options over time to fill the space and give people kind of a open bill in terms of what they want to do commercially on the site within the space constraints. So we have in there that $8 to $10 per square foot per year. That's how we generally communicate commercial rents. That is lower than what you see for similar rents out near the highway. It's a conservative estimate for sure. And it, again, alludes to some of the access issues that we've spoken about. This would make, if that truly would be the rent that's seen here, it would likely be a challenge for a developer to come into the site without getting some sort of assistance, outside assistance from the state or from the city. On the residential side, the rents quoted here are just based on conversations we've had with brokers and with property owners in the city. These are broadly the rent ranges that you see at new or refurbished buildings in the city, and would be what you would likely need to achieve on the site in order to make it financially feasible. Again, as I spoke about before, these are still relatively low market rate rents for the Metro Boston area, especially relative to the cost of construction. So these, again, would likely require some of the tax credits, some of the programs that developers in Brockton have already taken advantage of to build previous projects.
I was going to say, $1,900 a month is kind of what you're seeing for new construction in the downtown area and for rehab. But given the distance between here to here, you're not going to get 1,900 here, so it's going to be somewhere between 13, 15, and 19. So that's how they're figuring out that sliding scale.
That's right. Okay, and then for each of these scenarios, and you'll see these on the boards as you move around as well, these are some really high-level sliding scale ratings that just kind of provide a way for you to think about how the projects might involve trade-offs between each other and how we envision different land uses. So I'll go through them one by one, especially for this first scenario. Financial feasibility is kind of what I've been speaking about. Is this a development scheme that would likely interest or attract a developer or an investor? And due to the high presence of market rate apartments, which Emily said would likely take a number of years to lease up in a market like Brockton, this is a relatively less financially attractive proposition right off the bat, just because, again, we don't know the depth of the market for units like that here. Transit utilization is basically just measuring how much are we taking advantage of the asset that we have at the commuter rail station. And so this is a measure of, are we situating residents and workers near the train station in a way where they can walk to it?
Back a slide. So this is the area that has the highest access to transit.
That's right.
Sorry.
That's okay. So this, because it is the highest number of apartments of the scenarios, the highest number of residents and workers, it is therefore the highest utilization of train access. Job creation is relatively strong for all of the scenarios. The amount of commercial space, commercial flex space, does not change that much from one scenario to another. all have opportunities for job creation and are rated in that way. Tax receipt impact is a complicated one. Basically, the way we've thought about this is almost a proxy for density. So generally, the higher the density project, the higher the underlying land value. So in this case, because this is the densest of the scenarios, you have more multifamily apartments, the taxable value per acre or per unit, or sorry, just per acre, will be necessarily higher. There are, of course, other considerations in this. This is a very simplistic view, and I'm happy to talk about that individually if people want to afterwards. But this is a way that you can think about it at a high level. And finally, development phasing. Again, this is just going back to how long a vision, how much time would you need for this vision to possibly come to fruition? And this is on the longer term side. Okay, back to